The applause started before the sentence even ended. My older brother stood in the center of the room, chest lifted, announcing that our parents had decided all 8 family rental houses in Florida would go to him, and the youngest gets nothing, he added as if it were a punchline. Laughter rose. A cousin whistled. My mother wiped a proud tear. My father leaned back like the decision was final. I didn't clap. I didn't shift. I just watched his fork stall halfway to his mouth. When the noise thinned, I smiled and said, "Dad, before you all get too comfortable, there's something you don't know." I grew up in a house where the noise always bent toward one person. My older brother walked into a room and conversations shifted, chairs, angled faces lifted. Even as kids, the pattern was set. On his birthdays, the table filled with balloons and frosting thick enough to hold candles upright. Mine were quieter, smaller, the kind where someone remembered the cake only when the knife had already been set down. I learned early that attention wasn't distributed, it was directed. In school, teachers mixed up our names. They always corrected themselves only when he laughed first. He had the easy charm, the loud voice, the kind of presence adults rewarded without questioning. I was the kid who finished worksheets early, waited, kept my hands folded on the desk. When I asked for extra math tutoring, my parents sighed, said money was tight, then bought another set of sports gear for him that same week. I didn't argue. I just did what I always did, folded the moment into silence and moved on. Family gatherings played out the same script. My achievements slipped between conversations like loose papers. His stories landed at the center of the table, retold as if each one had been a turning point for the entire family. A compliment for me usually came wrapped in comparison. Responsible, they called me. Independent, low maintenance, as if those were medals meant to make up for the absence of anything else. I learned to exist in the corners, close enough to be counted, far enough to be ignored. When I was accepted into a university out of state on a full scholarship, my father didn't hug me. He didn't tell me he was proud. He just said, "Well, someone has to leave Florida eventually," as if my leaving were a logistical convenience rather than an accomplishment. My mother called it practical, said this way I wouldn't be a burden. Meanwhile, my brother stayed home, stepped straight into the family's rental business like a throne waiting for him. He was praised for helping, even when helping meant depositing rent checks and calling himself a property manager. I left 2 days after my 22nd birthday, packed the back seat of my old car, drove north until Tampa dissolved in the rear window. Atlanta felt like oxygen after holding my breath for years. A small apartment, a desk, a job where people actually listened when I spoke. No shadows to measure myself against. For the first time, my life belonged only to me. Then my grandmother called. She lived in St. Pete, in a house that smelled like sea air and old paper. She was the only person in our family who ever looked at me without searching for him behind my shoulder. When she asked me to come down one weekend, I didn't question it. I drove down the long stretch of highway, arrived to find her waiting on the screened porch with 2 folders stacked on the table. She didn't waste time. She handed me the first folder, payments expenses logs, lines that didn't add up, rent that vanished. Categories labeled repairs with no receipts to match. 18 months of quiet siphoning from the properties she'd spent decades maintaining. I gave him access because he said he wanted to learn, she said, her voice steady. Turns out he learned something else. The second folder was heavier. Inside were the documents, a living trust naming her as trustee, and me as the successor, along with deeds already prepared to transfer ownership the moment she signed. No speeches, no emotional explanations, just her calm recognition of what needed to be done. We signed everything the following Monday, a notary sitting across from us while the ceiling fan clicked softly overhead. When it was done, she poured 2 small glasses of bourbon and said, "Now it's finished. Remember, this paper outlives promises." She made me swear to keep it quiet. I did. That was the day I understood, fully and finally, the place I had always held in this family, and the place she believed I deserved instead. After my grandmother's funeral, the house felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Not quiet, just emptied of the one person who ever saw me without comparison. I planned to drive back to Atlanta the next morning, but my mother called late that night, her voice soft in a way that felt rehearsed. "Stay one more day," she said. "We need to talk about the properties." I knew what that meant long before I walked into the dining room. The table was set like a business meeting. Coffee cups arranged in a row, legal pads lined up, my father at the head, as if presiding over something official. My older brother leaned back in his chair, legs stretched out, tapping a pen against his palm like he already knew the outcome. My mother hovered behind them, fussing with napkins no one would use. My father pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. "This is just a simple form," he said, "a waiver. Since your brother has been managing everything here in Florida, it only makes sense for him to take full responsibility. This just prevents confusion down the line." I didn't touch it. Not yet. My mother jumped in quickly, her smile tight. "It's nothing personal, sweetheart. You're building a life in Atlanta. He's here. It keeps things peaceful." My brother finally spoke, impatience cracking through the confidence. "Come on, just sign it. No lawyers, no drama. Let's keep this clean." The room smelled like lemon polish and stale coffee. I lifted the paper with 2 fingers. 8 property addresses listed neatly. A signature line waiting for me to erase myself. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I wanted anything. They assumed the same thing they always had, that I'd bend. Stay quiet. Make it easy. I slid the paper back across the table. "I'm not signing this." The words didn't rise or fall. They just existed, heavy enough to tilt the air. My father's eyebrows shot up. "Don't start," he warned, the tone he used when I was a teenager coming home late. My mother's eyes glossed. My brother scoffed under his breath. But I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't give them anything to push against. I just stood, picked up my keys, and said nothing at all. On my way to the door, my brother muttered, "She'll come around." I almost smiled. They truly believed that. I drove back to Atlanta the same night, headlights carving a narrow path through the dark stretch of highway. The air inside the car felt heavier than it should have, like the words I hadn't said were riding in the back seat. When I reached my apartment just after dawn, the city was still quiet. Only the hum of early traffic drifted up from the street below. I placed my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and walked straight to the small shelf in my living room. The fireproof folder sat exactly where I had left it, top corner spine facing outward, untouched. I pulled it down, feeling the familiar weight settle into my hands. I set it on the dining table, the same table where I spent nights reviewing contracts and payments for my job. This time I opened it not as an analyst, but as someone preparing for something far more personal. The trust came first, then the deeds. 8 sets of recorded pages each with the county seal pressed into the corner. I laid them out one by one, forming a precise grid across the table. The paper felt cool against my fingertips. Organized. Final. The room felt still, like it understood what I was about to do. I booted up my laptop, opened a blank spreadsheet, and began typing. Columns for addresses. Columns for dates signed. Columns for record numbers. Columns for payments from tenants, clean ones, and the ones that didn't match. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was simply arranging facts in a language I knew better than any conversation my family had ever forced me to sit through. The group chat from home kept lighting up my phone. First, a stream of messages from my mother, all variations of "let's keep the peace." Then a text from my father, "don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then from my brother, "grow up." I muted the thread and kept working. Printing, filing, labeling, sliding each document into a fresh sleeve. I moved in a quiet rhythm, the kind that came naturally when I felt the ground under my feet again. No trembling, no rush, just the steady click of keys and the low whir of the printer. Outside, the city brightened. People walked dogs on the sidewalk, coffee shops opened, car engines started. Life moved on without knowing that mine was folding into a shape I'd been preparing for 2 years. In the afternoon, I stepped out onto the balcony. The wind carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs. The skyline shimmered in the heat, buildings stacked like file cabinets against the blue. I held the railing, watched the city breathe, and let the weight of the morning settle. My grandmother's voice threaded into the quiet the way memories do when the world slows. Not emotional, not fragile, just steady like truth spoken by someone who never had to raise her voice. Paper outlives promises. I returned inside, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and laid it open on the living room rug. The zipper echoed softly as it stretched across the frame. I placed the deeds inside first, then the trust, then the copies of payments and reports I had printed over the last 2 hours. I added a flash drive with digital scans, everything aligned, everything exact. The suitcase wasn't full, but it felt full enough. I packed clothes, next simple, neutral, nothing that would stand out in a crowded room. Then a pair of low heels, the kind I wore to property walkthroughs. Then my favorite blouse, the one with the crisp collar that always sat clean under a blazer. I zipped the suitcase partially closed, leaving a small gap at the top. The sound clicked into the room like a marker in time. Evening settled. The apartment glowed with the muted gold of sunset. I made tea, sat on the sofa, and let the steam warm the space around me. I didn't check my phone. I didn't reread the documents. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been signed years earlier. Around 10, I stood and pulled the suitcase fully shut. The click echoed louder this time. The next morning, I loaded the suitcase into the trunk of my car. The city was just waking up, commuters hurrying through crosswalks, the skyline washed in pale peach light. I merged onto the highway heading south. The drive had become muscle memory mile markers slipping by like quiet assurances. With every hour I put behind me, the noise from my family felt farther away. Their expectations, their pressure, their belief that silence meant surrender. By early afternoon, palm trees lined the interstate. The air grew warmer, thicker, familiar in the way childhood homes feel familiar even after you've surpassed them. I could almost see my grandmother's porch, hear the creak of her rocking chair, the soft click of her ceiling fan as she signed her name on the deeds I now carried back with me. When I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Tampa, I popped the trunk to check the suitcase. It sat where I left it, the handle upright, the documents settled inside like a loaded truth waiting for air. I closed the trunk gently. Back on the road, I rehearsed nothing. I planned no speech, no confrontation. My part was already done. The system would handle the rest. The signatures, the seals, the dates, that was my voice. That was my answer. Late afternoon light burned across the highway as I approached the exit to my family's neighborhood. I slowed, turned down the familiar street, and felt the calm settle over me again, the same calm I'd felt signing the papers with my grandmother 2 years earlier. This time, I wasn't returning to soften anything. I was returning to end it. By the time I reached the house, cars were already lining the street. Relatives I barely recognized stood in clusters on the lawn, drinks in hand, talking like the future had already been printed and framed. Through the windows, I could see decorations strung across the living room banners, flowers, brochures laid out on the table as if they belonged to a new empire. My older brother was at the center of it all, laughing too loudly, retelling the same story of stepping up for the family. My parents hovered nearby, nodding proudly, absorbing every compliment as if it were meant for them. I walked through the door without announcing myself. The conversation dipped for a second, then carried on, assuming I was simply late to applaud. I set my suitcase beside the couch, upright visible. A few people glanced at it, then at me, and looked away quickly. My brother tapped his glass again, the same gesture from earlier in the week. The room shifted toward him, voices softening into expectation. I just want to thank everyone, he began, for supporting this next chapter. Mom and Dad trusted me with all 8 of our rentals, and I promise I'll... The rest of his sentence dissolved under a new sound. The soft, steady roll of my suitcase wheels across the hardwood. The room quieted curiosity, replacing celebration. I stopped at the center table, clicked open the latches, and lifted the lid. Inside, the documents sat in perfect order. I placed the first deed on the table, then the second, then the third, 8 in total. Each stamped, recorded, signed years ago. Each one a quiet truth waiting to be heard. The trust came last, thick, smooth, unmistakable. I set it on top of the stack. My father stepped forward, his face draining of color. "Cheryl, what is this?" I didn't look at him. I just shifted slightly so the family attorney who had arrived minutes earlier to celebrate had a clear view. He moved closer, adjusting his glasses, reading the header, the signatures, the dates. "These are recorded," he said, voice flattening into something official. All 8 properties were transferred into a living trust 2 years ago, and she He nodded toward me. Is the legal successor. My brother's voice cracked before it rose. What? No. No, what are you talking about? They were supposed to go to me. The attorney didn't raise his tone. They were no longer your grandmother's to give. They've been under her trust and her chosen successor since the documents were signed and notarized. My brother grabbed one of the deeds, flipping pages, as if a different ending would appear between them. This is fake. It isn't, the attorney replied. I notarized similar filings for her myself. Everything here is consistent. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. Somewhere near the back, a cousin whispered a small, stunned, "Oh." Then from the hallway, a voice I hadn't heard all afternoon. My younger brother stepped forward. The quiet one. The one everyone forgot was in the room. I drove her to the notary, he said softly. She asked me not to tell anyone. She said Cheryl would understand. My mother covered her mouth. My father sank into a chair like the weight of the last decade had finally settled on his shoulders. My older brother stared at the documents, chest heaving, waiting for someone to rescue him. No one did. The room stayed perfectly still, the only sound the low hum of the air conditioning as the truth settled over everyone like a closing door. I drove back to Atlanta before sunrise the next morning. The roads were empty, the sky still colorless, the kind of quiet that feels like it belongs to no one. My suitcase sat in the back seat, the documents inside no longer heavy, just settled, like something that had finally returned to where it belonged. When I reached my apartment, the city was waking up. Lights flicked on in high-rise windows. Someone walked a dog across the street. The world kept moving, unaware that mine had just shifted into a simpler shape. I placed the suitcase in the corner, opened it only long enough to take out the fireproof folder. I set it on the highest shelf where sunlight wouldn't reach and no one else's hands ever would. The click of the shelf settling felt like a quiet punctuation. Later, I stepped onto the balcony with a mug of coffee. Midtown stretched out beneath me, traffic humming, voices, faint a breeze brushing the edges of the railing. For the first time in a long time, my phone didn't vibrate with demands or guilt or explanations disguised as concern. No messages from my parents, no new group chats, nothing pulling me backward. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was space clean, unoccupied, finally mine. I thought of my grandmother then. Not her voice, not her warnings, just the way she looked, the day we signed everything, the steadiness in her eyes, the certainty. She hadn't given me a burden. She'd given me permission. Behind me, the apartment stayed still, morning light drifting across the floorboards. Ahead of me, the city kept unfolding, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to go back. Some truths don't need to be argued. They just settle the way paper settles into a folder, quiet, precise, undeniable. I learned that boundaries aren't loud. They're the doors you close without explanation, the signatures you don't announce, the silence you choose because it finally belongs to you. My family keeps searching for the version of me who bent, who stepped aside, who stayed small. She's gone. What remains is the life I built the moment I stopped waiting for their permission. If stories like this stay with you, stay close. There are more truths worth hearing.